Hello everybody and welcome back to my videos. First of all, the videos are going to be a little bit slower this month because university has decided to rain down blessings in the form of exams and assignments. One of the things I love to do is load them into cannons and shoot them out like they do at festivals, you know what I mean? But because we are not in a romantic relationship, you will understand that I cannot give you 100% of my energy during the month of October, so it's gonna be fine, we're gonna be okay. But then after October, we're gonna have a lot of videos coming out, so get ready. Also, forgive me for the noise that you will most likely hear in the background of this video. I am gonna be moving soon. So today for Salt Saturdays, we're going to be talking about a very monumental, I guess you could say, part of Australia's history that happened in the state of Tasmania in 1996, and that was the Port Arthur Massacre. And I do have to give a content warning about this one. This one's a really heavy one, especially since there are little children that were also victims in this case too. So I leave it up to you to discern if you're in the right state of mind to watch a video like this today. It's heavy. It's a heavy one. You can go away and you can come back to this video when you feel a little bit better. No pressure. And additionally, if you're from a country where this type of thing, risk of this is high every time you leave the house. Additionally, just to have a little think about if you should be watching this video, because I don't want to add to your fear or your paranoia or anything like that. So just take care of yourself, you know. And now, without further ado, we are going to continue on with the video today. So, the Port Arthur Massacre. Wow, the lasting effects that this had on Australia was absolutely huge. It literally brought about gun control. In modern history within Australia, and if you exclude some instances of gang-on-gang violence, Port Arthur was the single worst, most horrific massacre to ever really happen on Australian soil. And as I mentioned previously, was the fundamental reason as to why we have so many rules and regulations surrounding owning guns within Australia. So to clarify further on that, we can own guns, it's just the rules and the regulations around owning them and all the money you have to pay kind of takes the fun out of it. So my ex-boyfriend, he owned a few weapons, so I'm kind of familiar with all the rules and regulations and everything, especially that he had to go through to own the weapons that he owned. And an example of this was that we were at the gun range once and I wanted to make myself useful, and I went down to pick up the case that one of the weapons was inside to bring it up onto the platform that you would shoot from. He just about nearly had a heart attack because he was like, only the person that owns the guns that the weapons are registered to can pick up the case. And I was like, okay, gosh, Mr. Bossy. But yeah, that's just like an example of one of the rules and regulations that you have. And this is not even scratching the surface on it, so just to give you a little bit of context on it. But continuing on, this all takes place on a rather large island at the very bottom of Australia, which is separate from the mainland and is its own state within itself, and that is the state of Tasmania. Tasmania is known for having absolutely breathtakingly beautiful countryside, which is very comparable to the UK and to Ireland. Especially, it also has very many historical buildings and beautiful landmarks as well. Everything is very heritage listed. I noticed that when I visited there a few times when my father lived in Launceston. It's especially famous for its beer as well. The two leading beer exports in Tasmania is called Bogues and Cascade. But unfortunately, it was this beautiful landscape to which the worst tragedy in modern Australian history took place. And it took place in a town called Port Arthur. And Port Arthur is located to the southeasterly of the island. Unfortunately, this would be the backdrop where 35 people would lose their lives and 23 more would become seriously injured. So first and foremost, the town of Port Arthur was already a very historically rich site to go through. It was a very well-known tourist attraction, and this was largely because the British set up a very well-known convict transportation route all up and down the coast of Australia. So during the 18th and 19th centuries, the plan was to extradite criminals from the UK and Ireland, bring them by ship over to Australia, and basically lock them up to fulfill the remainder of their sentences in prisons within Australia. So these great big penitentiaries used to house hundreds of convicts from all different parts of the UK and Ireland. But Port Arthur especially was designed to house the worst of the worst. And in addition to this, it was also designed to house those that had previously escaped or those that had been let out after fulfilling their sentences and then they would just go and reoffend. So, you know, it was a pretty rough place. The history of this penitentiary was pretty rich in its brutality towards its convicts that were housed there at the time. And for these prisoners, the punishments were not for the faint of heart, unfortunately. Port Arthur Penitentiary was commonly known for having like psychological treatments towards its patients as well as psychological punishments. It was even alleged that some of the inmates would inflict irreversible permanent outcomes on themselves because they didn't want to stay at Port Arthur anymore because the conditions were so bad and they were treated so poorly. This was a common occurrence, so much so that they even created this awful place called the Isle of the Dead, and that was where they would put all of the bodies of all of the convicts that had passed away. And they passed away of other things too, like sickness and murder, unfortunately. But yeah, this site just basically became a dumping ground. And it is estimated that over 1,646 graves are in the Isle of the Dead, out of only the 180 that are actually marked. And in addition to this, not only were the convicts buried there too, but some of the staff, like the doctors and the psychologists and the nurses, were also buried there as well. Only 180 have markers indicating that it's someone's grave. But finally, in 1977, Port Arthur Penitentiary closed its doors. So already we can kind of paint the picture that there's some pretty interesting vibes going on at around this place. There's a lot of bad juju that's accumulated here. So since then, and of course under new management, Port Arthur was turned into more of a tourist attraction, and this was largely due to the beautiful surroundings in the area and also due to the fact that there was a lot of ghost stories swirling around it too. People seeing convicts and shadows and apparitions and ghosts, so there was a lot of public interest swirling around Port Arthur. And little by little, before you know it, sometime I think in the 20th century, it was a very well-known tourist attraction. So we're in like roughly 1927 now. I want to fast forward a lot to 1992 where this story takes place. So a woman with a very large estate by the name of Helen Harvey passed away in a car accident. She had no children and as a result she didn't really have anyone to pass on her large estate. She decided to leave it all to a young man called Martin Bryant, who was 25 years of age at the time. And she left him an absolutely ginormous inheritance. I'm talking like $500,000. Actually no, more than that, you know what I mean? Huge sum of money. And in the years after he died, Martin Bryant spent this on traveling around the world. One of the things that he bought was actually a gun. So not only would he withdraw large sums of cash at a time, he also had a particular interest in buying weapons as well. And one of these weapons was called a AR-10 semi-automatic rifle, and he also later purchased an AR-15. One he bought from a gun shop and the other he bought from like a newspaper advertisement, but I'm not sure which is which. So it was sometime in the early 90s when Martin Bryant's father wanted to buy a piece of property, and this was no normal piece of property. This was a bed and breakfast that was located in Port Arthur, and I believe it was just very scenic. It was a very beautiful bed and breakfast, and Martin Bryant's father had basically put his heart and soul into buying this property. I think he was suffering with some mental health issues, and he thought that if he bought this property, by the way, it was called Seascape, that it would help him and it would give him something constructive to kind of put his energy into and everything like that. And just above all, he just really wanted to buy it, and he expressed to Martin, his son, that, you know, this was what he wanted to do. But as his father was kind of gathering his funds and getting all of his ducks in order, another family moved in and really quickly bought the property before he had any chance to react, and there was nothing he could do. The property was lost, and his father was absolutely crushed that these two other people, I believe they knew them, I believe they knew this couple. It was a married couple, a man and a woman. Martin in particular was really upset with this other couple that they had done this to his father. He saw it as like a huge personal attack. He was not happy at all. And unfortunately, later on in 1993, Martin Bryant's father actually, as a result of, you know, his really bad mental health issues, he blamed the other couple, whose last name was also Martin. He blamed the Martin family for doing this to his father. He really thought that because they had done that to his father and bought this piece of property, that this is what had brought on his father He was really upset and really angered, so angered that they had done this to him. He was quoted by calling the Martins very mean people and the worst people in his life. So later on, a little bit, a few years later in 1995, Martin Bryan's own mental health had started to deteriorate. He started drinking a lot. He just kind of felt that like everyone was against him. He was reported to have said that, you know, whenever he tries to be nice to people, people just walk away, and that, yeah, everyone was against him. So honestly, every other details about how this came about's not very clear, because it's almost like he himself doesn't even know how on earth this came about. So it was 6 a.m. on the 28th of April 1996. Quinn woke up early and he went out to his family and he greeted them all. And this was something that his family said was very unusual, because he typically didn't really care about stuff like that. But nevertheless, he came out to his family, he greeted them all, and roughly at about a few hours later, at roughly 8 a.m, he said goodbye to his girlfriend. And that at about 9:45 a.m, he drove to Port Arthur, and specifically he drove to Seascape, the property that his father wanted to buy that was now owned by the Martin family. So when he got there to Seascape, he exited his vehicle, he entered the property into the living room, and it was there that he took out his AR-15 assault rifle and started just firing shots into the living room. So it is believed in this time that he killed the wife. Her name was Nolene, but it wasn't really concluded as to how, but they do know that he went and found the husband. The husband was called David Martin. Found David, he gagged and bound him, where he began to stab him, and shortly thereafter David Martin passed away from his wounds. And these were his first two victims. So when he left the property, he closed and locked the door behind him, and there was actually two other people in the parking lot. He went up to these two other people and he said something along the lines of like, oh, you can't go in there at the moment, my family and my girlfriend are in there, go to the local cafe and come back later, or something like that. These two people reported that the conversation was just extremely bizarre and he was acting a little bit erratic, so they just left, and so did he. It's also at around about this time too where he actually ran into a man that he had met 15 years previously that knew Nolene and David Martin, and he said he had a very bizarre, very erratic conversation with him where he told this man, who was the Martins' groundskeeper or just the Martins' friend, I'm not sure, but he was a local to the area, and he told this man that he was actually going to buy the property next door for some reason. So then after that, at about 1 p.m. in the afternoon, he got into his car and he decided to head towards the Broad Arrow Cafe. When he went in there, he paid the toll, because I believe it's like a national park or something like that, a heritage listed site, something to the value of that. So yeah, he paid the toll, went in, but then the car park was full, so then he went and parked his car elsewhere. He then got out of his car and he was carrying a rather large bag with him, but it wasn't really a bag that looked anything out of the ordinary. It was just rather large inside, and it was at this time where he went up to the Broad Arrow Cafe and he went inside. So he was captured on CCTV doing this, and in fact there was even a security guard in the area at the time that did see him and did see his bag, but he just kind of thought nothing of it. Keep in mind, this is the 90s, this is before safety measures, before 9/11, safety and everything like that. It was just very relaxed back then. O'Brien entered the cafe where he sat down for a meal, and during this time he was sitting on the deck area that was kind of overlooking the harbour, and he was also within eyeshot of his car. So as he was kind of striking up some conversation with just the people that were sitting around him, he was also kept like looking back at his car apparently. But sometime after that, he finished his meal, he got up and walked back to the front counter with his tray, and he put the tray on the front counter. So upon doing this, he had his oversized bag with him as well, and he picked up the bag from the ground and he put it on the counter. He then proceeded to take out his AR-15 rifle, as well as a 30-round magazine, and it is believed that this magazine was almost empty as well from the previous shooting. So this cafe is really small, alright, but on that day it was especially packed inside and outside, because not only was it just kind of the season for tourists as well, but there was a lot of people that were also waiting for a ferry that was due to leave in the harbour within the hour. So there was a lot of people in the cafe too, and there was also people sitting down for a spot of lunch as well. So when Brian picked up the AR-15, he proceeded to point it at the nearest people sitting to him at a table that was to his left. And sitting at that table were two Malaysian tourists by the name of Mo Yi Nung and Sao Lang Chong. Before they even had a chance to react or even know what was going on, he shot them both fatally in the head. Then, just as quickly as he had done that, he then proceeded to pan the gun around to other patrons in the cafe, where a few of the bullets hit a man called Mick Sargent, but they just slightly grazed his scalp and knocked him off his chair onto the ground, where he was able to take shelter under a table. Unfortunately, Sargent's girlfriend, who was 21-year-old Kate Elizabeth Scott, was fatally shot in the back of the head, and she too didn't have time to react to what was going on. After this, Bryant turned his attention to a New Zealand family that consisted of a mother and father, as well as the mother's grandfather and her 15-month-old son. The grandfather was able to see what was going on, and he quickly grabbed his daughter and his grandson and shoved them both under the table. And in that time, a man called Anthony Nightingale was able to stand up and throw a tray at Bryant's head, but that only meant that he had then caught the attention of Bryant, and so then he panned the gun towards Mr. Nightingale and unfortunately fatally shot him in the chest and arm. Then Bryant turned his gun to 3 gentlemen that were sitting with their backs towards him. It consisted of 2 brothers and their friend. The first man that he shot was 86-year-old Kevin Vincent Sharp. Kevin was killed instantly when his friend, who was sitting next to him at the time, 66-year-old Walter Bennett, was also fatally shot in the back of the head as well. Then sitting next to Walter was 67-year-old Walter Sharp, who was also fatally shot in the back of the head. Nearby, 3 people were sitting by the names of Gerald Broom, Gay Fiddler, and her husband John Fiddler. 3 of them were not killed, but they were seriously injured by bullet fragments. Bryant then turned his attention towards more patrons that were sitting in the cafe, and their names were Tony and Sarah Kiston and Andrew Mills. Andrew Mills was killed instantly by a gunshot to the head. Tony Kiston was also fatally shot in the head as well, but not before he was able to grab his wife Sarah and shove her under a table. And it was at this time too when Thelma Walker, Pamela Law, Peter Crosswell, and Patricia Baker were all injured in the process as a result of the bullet fragments. But fortunately, all 4 of them survived. Then at this time, Bryant moved a few meters away to where 3 people were sitting by the names of Graham Kohler, Carolyn Laughlin, and her daughter Sarah were sitting. So also keep in mind this is happening very fast too, so people didn't really have very much time to react to what was going on. Bryant shot Graham in the jaw and then pointed his gun at Sarah. It was then that her mother saw what was about to happen and tried to jump on top of her daughter to protect her, but unfortunately within this time Sarah had already been fatally shot in the head. Brian turned his attention to a husband and wife that were sitting near a window. The first person he shot was the husband, who was named Mervyn Howard, and the bullet proceeded to go through him, killing him instantly and shattered the window that was next to them. Brian then turned his attention to Howard's wife, who was sitting next to her husband, where he fatally also shot her in the head and neck. It was also at this time too that the survivors still in the cafe were prevented from leaving because Bryant was kind of standing sort of in the doorway. So this left people to try to run to the gift shop that was adjacent to the cafe that was also conjoined. There was another exit in the gift shop too, so people had been trying to flee through that way. But of course, because people were trying to leave through that way, it caused a lot of commotion as well. So then Bryant knew that there was people escaped, so it led him to go into the gift shop. But in this instance, when Bryant got up and went to lead into the gift shop, there was another survivor that was hiding underneath the table that stood up in this time. As a result, Bryant, as he was leaving, turned his attention to this poor man and proceeded to shoot him a few times as well, but thankfully he was able to survive. So these events that happened in the cafe literally took place within 15 seconds. That's how quick this whole thing was. 15 seconds, 17 shots were fired, 12 people were killed, and 10 more were injured. So Bryant then moved towards the gift shop where people were hiding behind displays, that were hiding behind the racks, and they were also jumped the counter and were hiding behind there as well. So when Bryant entered into the gift shop, he opened fire on the 2 gift shop attendants that were working there at the time. They were 17-year-old Nicole Burgess and 26-year-old Elizabeth Howard. They were both shot in the chest, and the 2 of them did not survive their injuries. Dennis Lever in this time was also hiding in the gift shop as well. His wife Coralie was also hiding as well, but she was hiding elsewhere. And Bryant unfortunately saw Dennis and he began open firing on him as well and fatally killed him too. In this time, a whole bunch of survivors tried to escape through a locked door, but they had no luck getting it open. But then another survivor by the name of Gwen Ninda tried to make a run for it, running out the front door, but unfortunately she wasn't fast enough and she was fatally shot by Bryant from behind. So in this time, there was movement heard behind Bryant in the cafe, and it made him kind of turn around and just momentarily pause at the doorway to try to see if he could see anything. And because he did this, it unfortunately made the people in the gift shop think that he had gone, and a few of them started to come out from their hiding places in this time. One of those such people was Jason Wintour. He was the father of the 15-month-old that was a part of the New Zealand family, unfortunately. Bryant then noticed out of his peripheral vision that someone was standing in the gift shop, and he turned around and unfortunately opened fire on Jason Wintour. Unfortunately, he sustained bullets in his chest and head, and he did not survive his injuries. And the bullet fragments from this shooting struck another person hiding in the cafe, and he was an American tourist by the name of Dennis Olson, who was acting as a shield for his wife Mary. But thankfully, although he sustained really serious injuries, he did survive. So within this time in the gift shop, it's a bit of a grey area. They don't really conclusively know what happened, but it is believed that he did reload his weapon before moving out of the gift shop again, but momentarily, but then coming back in a few moments later. It was within this time that he found Roland Jerry, Peter Nash, and Pauline Masters. And he opened fire on all three of them and killed all three of them. Peter was also acting as a shield for his wife Carolyn, who was laying beneath him, but she was able to survive. And as a result of this, he then had to reload his rifle again, and he left the empty magazine on the counter of the gift shop, where he proceeded to leave out the front doors of the gift shop. So in this time, Bryant had killed 8 more people and wounded 2 others. So he had now killed a total of 20 people and had wounded 12 more. So in this time, a fair few people had fled the cafe, and they were now running into the car park. And the car park was full. It was a very busy day, and there was also a number of buses and coaches that were in the car park too. I believe something like 5 or 6. There was quite a lot of people here, but people were really confused. You know what I mean? Like I said, pre 9/11, pre everything, pre the days where we had to worry about this type of thing when we went out into public, and people just didn't know what was going on. People were really confused, and I think the hard part was that people actually thought that this was a part of some kind of reenactment, and they actually started to go towards the shooting because they thought that there was something interesting taking place. There were others too that tried to usher people away and tried to say, you know, you need to get away from the area, there's an active shooter, but a lot of people, but everybody was just so dispersed that it just wasn't enough to let everyone know that there was danger and they needed to move away from the area. In this time, Bryant entered the car park, and this was where he saw a man called Royce Thompson, who was a driver to one of the coaches, and Royce was walking up alongside his coach. I believe that was closest to the building, so he was the first person that Bryant saw upon entering the car park. He then proceeded to gun down Mr. Thompson, but Mr. Thompson was actually able to kind of crawl his way underneath his coach, but unfortunately moments later he succumbed to his injuries. So this is a little bit confusing to try to explain, so I'm sorry if I try to refer to my notes. I'm just trying to accurately paint the picture for you. So all the coaches and the buses were kind of lined up alongside each other, and I believe that Bryant was kind of like doing a zigzagging motion, if you will. And within this time, other people had started to usher people down more towards the water and towards the wharf, but there was a few people that were still remained in the car park that were actually trying to get into the coaches for safety. So as Brian began to walk in between the coaches, he did look up a few times and see some people that had taken shelter in there, and he only fired like a few rounds at people, but fortunately he didn't hit anyone. And it was within this time that he came upon a group of people, and within that group was a woman called Winifred Applin, who was actually trying to, I think, run across something to get to the safety of one of the buses, but unfortunately she was fatally shot by a rain of bullets from Bryant. The woman that was running behind her, called Yvonne Lockley, she was able to just only be grazed by the bullets, and she was able to survive. So in this time, people were moving towards the water, but for some reason someone said that he was then coming there, which then caused everybody else to double back towards the coaches. So as you can imagine, there's a lot of frenzied, panicked people that are hearing the gunshots going off. So people are like running, people are like bolting, trying to get away from the danger. And it was within this time frame that a woman called Janet Quinn, who was actually a wildlife park owner, I believe in far north Queensland, and tried to get into one of the coaches, but Bryant came up behind her and shot her from behind. She fell to the ground, and where she fell, and she was right near the body of Royce Thompson, the coach driver, who had only passed away not too long ago. And as other people were fleeing the scene, people were fleeing in every which direction. Some were hit by the bullets, but a majority of them within this specific time were able to survive. So within this time, Bryant had walked away and had seen everybody fleeing in different directions. He fired some shots here and there, but thankfully he did miss a lot of people. But then he decided to double back to where Janet Quinn was lying on the ground near the body of Royce Thompson. At this point, she was still alive, but he came upon her body where he proceeded to shoot several rounds into her back, fatally killing her. It was then that he turned his attention to another woman called Elva Gaylard, who was trying to open the door of a coach, and unfortunately he fatally shot her too in the arm and the chest. Within this time, Janet Quinn's husband Neville was down at the waterfront, was down at the dock, and he had actually realised that she wasn't there, and he decided to leave the waterfront area to go back up into the car park to try to find his wife. And as he went back into the car park and he saw the coaches, it was then within that time that Brian also saw him approaching the area. Neville turned and ran and tried to run away from Bryant, but Bryant just ran after him and proceeded to chase him. Neville managed to get the door open of one of the coaches and run inside to the back of the bus, but Bryant also ran onto the coach as well and proceeded to say something to the effect of, "Nobody escapes from me," in which time he pointed his gun directly at Neville and fired a few rounds, but Neville was able to duck and miss them. Unfortunately, one bullet did go into his neck, but it only temporarily paralysed him. But nevertheless, he survived. Now we are at a total of 26 people that have been killed and a furthermore 18 that have been injured. Then Bryant decided to go back to his vehicle, where he proceeded to get into his car and drive off, and witnesses reported him honking the horn as he did so, as well as waving at other survivors as he left. He drove up the embankment towards the toll booth, and he actually passed quite a fair few people that were running away from the scene, but unfortunately he came across a mother and her 2 children by the name of Nanette Mittak, and the 3 of them had actually been running for roughly 600 metres away from the whole ordeal as soon as it happened. So Nanette was holding her 3-year-old daughter called Madeline, and running just a few steps in front of them was her 6-year-old daughter called Alana. And when Bryant came up behind them in his car, he slowed down and he opened his door and he came to a complete stop. Nanette actually thought that maybe this was someone that was trying to help her, so she stopped and she turned towards the man, but Brian only stepped out of his car holding his rifle, where he told Nanette to get down on her knees, and she did, obviously terrified because she could see the rifle. And unfortunately this only led to Brian shooting Nanette in the head, where he then proceeded to turn his weapon on 3-year-old Madeline and 6-year-old Alana. Sorry, that always makes me a little bit emotional. After this, he got back in his car, where he proceeded to drive up to the toll booth. But the toll booth was already backed up by about 2 or 3 cars at the time. There was another car, a black BMW, that was also, I think, attempting from another intersection to drive on into the queue. But Bryant actually cut off the BMW, so this was the BMW and this was Bryant's car. They were kind of stuck. And within the black BMW was 4 passengers. In the driver's seat was a man called Russell James Pollard. In the passenger seat was actually the owner of the vehicle, Mary Nixon, and in the back was husband and wife Helen and Robert Saltzman. So Robert, who was actually sitting in the back, got out first, probably said something to the effect of like, "What are you doing? There's an active shooter, like let us go through," you know what I mean? So when Robert, who was sitting in the back of the vehicle, got out to start this argument with Bryant, it only made Bryant exit his vehicle again, where he pointed his rifle at Robert and began open fire, fatally shooting him in the chest and neck. So at this time, Russell Pollard, the driver, had also gotten out as well and saw what was going on, and he tried to intervene too, but unfortunately it just meant that Brian then turned the rifle from Mr. Saltzman to Mr. Pollard, where he also was fatally shot as well. And then Bryant turned towards the remaining occupants in the car. So sitting in the passenger seat was the owner of the vehicle, Mary Nixon, and then sitting behind her was her friend Helen. He proceeded to open fire upon these ladies as well, also fatally killing them, where he then removed their bodies from the vehicle and began transporting items from his own car to the BMW. So it was believed that he took ammo, handcuffs, his AR-15 rifle, and a full container of fuel from his car into the BMW, but it's believed that he, for some reason, left a whole load of more ammo as well as some other weapons back in his car as well. So within this time, all the other cars managed to just break through the toll booth and had all driven away and fled the scene because they could see and hear what was happening behind them. When Bryant got inside the BMW, he then just proceeded to take off and leave. And he went onto onto the highway and started to drive towards a service station. In this time, he had cut off a silver Toyota Corolla, and he had done this in a style to which the two cars ended up pulling over on the side of the road. Inside the silver Toyota Corolla was a man and a woman. The driver was 35-year-old Glenn Pierce, and his girlfriend, 28-year-old Zoe Hall, was in the passenger seat. When both vehicles stopped, Bryant got out of his car with his rifle, where he proceeded to walk up alongside Miss Hall's side of the car. Quickly her boyfriend got out, and I believe he tried to intercept her or something before he got to Miss Hall's side of the car, but in a bizarre turn of events, Bryant then turned the gun onto Glenn Pierce and ushered him back to the BMW and made him forcefully get inside the boot, where he slammed the boot down and locked it and made it so Mr. Pierce couldn't get out again. He then proceeded to head back towards the silver Corolla, in which time I believe Miss Hall had locked the doors and she had tried to climb into the back of the car, but as soon as he reached the back car window, he fired several shots into the silver Toyota Corolla and fatally shot Miss Hall. So at this time, Miss Zoe Hall was the 34th victim of Bryant. So over the road at the gas station, there was a whole heap of people that saw this whole thing go down. Again, this happened very quickly, so people were hiding and the service station attendant was able to come out and lock the door, and he also went into the back and tried to get his own personal gun too, but before he could kind of get outside and get onto the highway and get a clear shot of Bryant had already taken off. In addition to this, the police officers were not too far behind. There were police that were called to the scene, but it was just so hard to get a gauge on what was happening and where this man had gone. But there was a police officer on call that I believe had been told on the phone about what was happening, and he was able to pursue Bryant in his police car. And the people from the service station also called the police too and gave a description of the BMW that he was driving. Brave police officer, I'll say that. Gosh. God, how would you be chasing after a madman like that? I take my hat off to them, my gosh. So during this time, Bryant had actually decided to chuck a U-bolt somewhere and go back to Seascape, back in the direction from which he had just came. So he went to the initial parking lot back in the area of Seascape, but not too close to the actual residence itself. And it was during this time that there were a few passing cars coming from every which direction, and he just got out of his car and stood there and just was kind of firing open shots everywhere. And he did hit a few people and he smashed a few windscreen and a few side windows, but thankfully he didn't kill anybody within this time. He just injured a few. It was coming around to about 2 o'clock in the afternoon now when Bryant got back in the VW and started to drive further, closer to the residence of Seascape, and he was able to park the BMW into the driveway. And all while the bodies of Mr. and Mrs. Martin were still lying inside the home at this time, undiscovered. When he arrived, he got Mr. Pierce, who must have been absolutely terrified. He got him out of the boot and ushered him into the home, where he then proceeded to handcuff him to the railing of the stairwell that was going upstairs, and he just left him there. And it was also reported in this time too that he had set the BMW on fire. If you're wondering how I'm getting through this video, this is how, bottoms up. Oh! Oh, yes. I like wine that bites back. So I'm not sure what happened within this time frame, if there was a standoff or something, I'm not sure. But basically the next day, the next morning, a fire had either broken out in the guest house or in the downstairs basement, I'm not sure which. But police concluded that this fire had definitely been started by Bryant himself. And there were so many police that were gathering outside, but they just weren't doing anything. They were just buying their time a little bit. And unfortunately, they had already kind of theorized that Mr. Pierce was most likely already dead. And they knew that it was only a matter of time either, because they knew that pretty soon this fire would engulf the whole premises. And so essentially what they were going to do is they were just going to wait it out for him to eventually come out of the house when it was burning to the ground. Within this time, Bryant was also taunting the police and saying things to them like, oh, I bet you wish you could catch me, or something like that. He was just taunting them a fair bit. But again, Tasmanian police were just remaining calm, and they were just buying their time until they knew that he had to eventually come out of the building. And it was a good call, because eventually he did come out of the building. He came running out of the building when it was pretty much engulfed in flames, and he came out with a majority of his clothes on fire, and he sustained burns to his back, chest, legs and buttocks. Shortly thereafter, he was arrested and taken into police custody. The fire was put out, and it was at this time that the bodies of the Martins were discovered, as well as the body of Mr. Pierce. And it was reported that he had actually died the previous evening, and he had died from a gunshot wound either to his body or to his head. It was also concluded, unfortunately, that Nolene Martin, who was the wife, had also been severely beaten. So In the aftermath of all of this, Bryant was held under extremely heavy guard at the Roebuck Royal Hospital, where he was taken for treatment for his burns. And he basically waited there for the majority of the time where he was awaiting trial, so I'd say he was there for a few weeks to a few months. And he was happy with himself. That's the cold part about it. He absolutely loved what he had achieved, unfortunately. And he was even asking people if he could see news reports about himself, and he wanted to know the number of people that he had killed. The thing about this is it was either the Premier or it was the Governor General that when they found out about this, they limited him that he could only listen to the radio. When they found out about this, he was prohibited from watching the news, and he could only listen to the radio on specific stations where you couldn't get any of the news. And they also told all of the photographers that had taken his picture to delete all of their photos of him, because they additionally didn't want his photos circling around news media. And I think that was a really respectful move to make, so I applaud them for that. During the police interviewing, he had made several false and wrong and just plain made up statements. And yeah, you could say to a certain point that he was mentally disturbed, but to what point though? Like, at what point was he playing this up? Because he allegedly had reported that he never carjacked the BMW, that he never took it out of the lot, that there were only 4 people in the BMW, and that the other weapons in his bag were simply not his. So even though there was a psychological evaluation done on Bryant, he was deemed medically fit to stand trial. But of course, he pled not guilty initially to the 35 counts of murder that he had committed during this mass shooting. But eventually, thank goodness, he did plead guilty, because it's like, what else could he possibly do? He didn't have a single leg to stand on in this argument, thank God. And as a result, he was sentenced to 35 life sentences for each count of murder, as well as an additional 25 years for the remaining 36 charges and 5 other offences. And those 5 other offences were 20 attempted murders, 3 counts of infliction of grievous bodily harm, the infliction of wounds upon a further 8 persons, and 4 counts of aggravated assault, and 1 count of unlawfully setting fire to property. So basically, needless to say, I don't think he's getting out of prison, thank goodness. Like I mentioned earlier in this video, this led to our Lord and Saviour John Howard, who was the Prime Minister of Australia at the time. He basically developed the strict gun control laws. So thank you, John Howard, for doing the decent thing. And of course, the victims in this instance were honoured. They had their own individual funerals, as well as a public memoriam that was established in each and every one of their names. There is a beautiful plaque that was unveiled in memoriam to them all, and it was donated by the Governor General of Australia, and his name was Sir William Dane. So in just a few weeks after this awful thing happened, the tourist attraction opened up again. I believe the cafe was either pulled down or it was rebuilt into a restaurant or something like that. But in any which way, it was changed, and in its place there was a memorial garden that was built. It's very beautiful. It's a very tranquil location. And on the 20th anniversary of the massacre, a memorial service was held at Port Arthur, and over 500 people turned up to celebrate the memory of every single perfect and beautiful life that was taken that day. And that concludes this video. This was just such a horrible thing to happen. And every single life was special. Every single life was special. Every single life was valid. It was so pointless that there were so many lives in this instance that were taken, but I just want to say a special mention to Alana and Madeline. That was really hard. That was really hard to read. It was those poor little beautiful girls. So sad. But we all need to remember them, you know what I mean? I'm a millennial. I was born 2 years before this happened, and I was raised in Far North Queensland, and I barely heard about this. My own personal research into this shooting is the most I've ever learned about it. And I think that's really sad. And that's really sad towards maintaining the integrity of the memory of all of these people, that I've just barely heard about this, which it's quite a monumental piece of Australian history. And it just needs to be remembered. It needs to be talked about more. I know it's sad, I know it's grisly, but we can't let the memory of all of these people fade away. Now, I thank you very much, as I always do at the end of these videos, for clicking on this video. It really does help to maintain the memory of all of these beautiful people, these 35 people. So thank you very much for watching. This was a hard one, admittedly. Oh, Christ. That it is very appreciated that you've contributed to keeping the memories of all of these people alive today. So thank you for that yet again. I know that there were so many of them, but there are so many more of us, and we can all together help to honor their memories for their loved ones that are still around today. So as always, take care and stay safe out there. Thank you.